Sometimes the hardest thing isn't just change itself, but letting go of what worked before. Even something that felt like, well, the cornerstone of your success. It kind of reminds me of this story in the material we're exploring today. It's about an old farmer over in Perth, Western Australia. He'd finally handed the reins of his really successful farm over to his son. And, well, the son immediately started shaking things up, doing things differently, even selling off parts of the land the father had spent his whole life cultivating. The old man, his name was Bill, was apparently furious. Didn't hold back, I gather, even called his son stupid for not taking his tried and true advice. But years later, sitting alone in this simple motel breakfast room, Bill had this quiet moment of reflection. He looked back and realized that stupid son hadn't been dismantling the farm at all. He'd been restructuring it. Yeah, he sold off some original plots, but he bought better, new land, diversified what they grew, and ultimately built a far more productive, more resilient farm than Bill had ever managed.
The best thing Bill did, he realized, was just hand over the farm and get out of the way. And it finally allowed them to talk again, father and son. So the core question posed right at the start of this dive is, are we in our own contexts, whatever established structures we're part of, are we willing to experience that kind of, pain? Are we willing to let go of familiar structures, maybe even properties or institutions that feel foundational, if that's what's needed, to become something more dynamic, more like a movement again?
That farmer analogy, Bill and his son, it really does cut to the core tension, doesn't it? It just highlights the challenge of transition, I think. Today, we're taking a deep dive into what movement structures could potentially look like today. And we're drawing specifically on the powerful lessons presented in the New Testament examples found within the sources you've brought us. We're going to try and unpack the key principles, the structures, the leadership models these sources highlight, and look at how they create a pretty stark contrast with more, let's say, traditional institutional approaches. Our goal here really is to distill what's truly important for you to grasp about this potential path, this move from a state of maintenance to a state of dynamic movement.
Okay, yeah, let's unpack this, because that farmer story really sets the stage so well. It's that tension, isn't it? The pain of change versus the potential for, greater fruitfulness. Tell us a little more about Bill's realization and how the material connects that to this broader idea of restructuring.
Right. So Bill, this highly successful farmer, was genuinely agitated, really frustrated that his son wasn't just copying his methods. Apparently, the language he used about his son was quite colorful.
Huh?
His son was selling parts of the very farm Bill had poured his life into. You can see why he'd be upset. But the realization came later. The son wasn't destroying the farm. He was strategically restructuring it. He let go of certain assets to acquire others, diversified beyond the original crops, and the result was, a more productive farm. The act of Bill handing over control, stepping back despite that initial pain and tension, was ultimately the catalyst for the farm's greater success. And interestingly, even the healing of their relationship. So the material uses this story to ask a pretty crucial question of leaders in established institutions or organizations today. Are they truly prepared for the possibility that the next generation of leaders might need to, sell the farm?
Metaphorically speaking.
Exactly, metaphorically. Letting go of established institutional investments, familiar properties, maybe long-standing, comfortable ways of doing things. If those new leaders discern that's what's required for the health and effectiveness of whatever mission they're pursuing.
Right. It sounds like the point is that clinging to the old structure, even if it was successful in a previous era, can actually become an obstacle to new growth and health, much like Bill initially was to his son's plans, maybe.
Precisely. It's that willingness to sacrifice the comfortable past for a potentially more dynamic future. Now, let's shift our focus slightly, because the sources lay out what they see as the foundational building blocks in the New Testament. They identify two basic units that characterize that early movement structure. Okay, so the first unit is the local churches. And what's emphasized here is that every single one started simply as a new plant, essentially gatherings of new disciples. Their fundamental role was taking full responsibility for mission multiplication right where they were, in their local areas and cities. They grew by evangelizing and multiplying through existing relational streams, planting more churches within those cities. Crucially, these local churches weren't just destinations. They were the umbrella base for all the disciple making and for multiplying planting teams. They were responsible for equipping, training, empowering, releasing, encouraging, and inspiring these teams.
So the local church wasn't just a place for people to gather in, but was fundamentally a base for sending people out. Is that the idea?
Exactly. It was both a gathering place and a launch pad, deeply integrated with the mission itself. And that leads us right to the second unit, planting teams. These are sometimes referred to as missionary bands or mobile apostolic bands, and the material highlights them as being, well, consistently affirmed and commissioned within the New Testament narrative. So what characterized these teams? They focused on working in new areas, making new disciples, and planting new churches among those new disciples. And the sources point out there were two remarkably clear metrics by which these teams were affirmed and supported by the wider movement.
Okay, what were they?
First, were they making new disciples, particularly in areas that hadn't been reached before?
Right.
And second, were they planting new churches composed of those new disciples?
That's a very sharp focus, a
Yeah.
very clear way to measure impact compared to maybe many metrics used today.
It certainly is. And the material stresses that these teams weren't just people who decided to go off on their own, self-appointed. They were seen as spirit-appointed and sent with clear approval from existing churches. The example from Acts 13.3 is highlighted often.
With Paul and Barnabas.
Exactly. The Antioch church fasted, prayed, laid hands on them, and commissioned them, sent them off for their work. And a few other key details are mentioned. These teams largely supported themselves financially. They received only limited and occasional support from the churches they planted. They also operated with significant freedom to go where they felt led, not really micromanaged by sending churches or any central authority, though they did maintain communication and share reports back.
Okay, so autonomous but connected.
Yes, precisely. And importantly, the churches they planted were always understood as part of the single body of Christ, sharing the common mission and fostering unity. This structure is kind of contrasted with independent ministries that might lack that deep connection to local churches or recognized leaders. And crucially, they might not have that laser focus on making new disciples or planting new churches. The material suggests such initiatives, while potentially doing good things, weren't really the core model of movement multiplication affirmed in the New Testament context. Taking this further, the sources illustrate how these basic units work together by looking at specific models Paul used, particularly originating from that dynamic, multicultural Antioch church that served as his base. So the first model is what's called ethne, which translates roughly to relational streams. This involved following existing relational connections, like when Paul and Barnabas traveled across Cyprus. It meant identifying persons of peace. That's a concept drawn from Luke 10.6.
Okay, people who are open.
Yes, individuals who are receptive and provide an entry point or a bridge into their existing social network. They saw churches planted throughout Galatia using this approach, building on those natural relationships.
So it's like starting where the connections already exist, following friendships or community ties.
Exactly. It's working with the grain of existing relationships. Makes sense, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, the second model is oikos, or household networks. On his second journey, Paul focused on cultivating multiple expressions of church within extended household networks. Think cities like Philippi, Thessalonica, Corinth. Now, oikos in that time meant more than just the nuclear family. It was an extended household. Today, that could include family, neighbors, colleagues, friends from different social circles, school, uni, sports, whatever. The material describes these as kind of dotted circles groups that are bonded relationally but deliberately open to others joining. You could have numerous such oikos-type churches across a single city, connected relationally and supported by overseers, reaching different segments of the population.
Interesting. And the third model, you mentioned a hub.
Right, the hub. Paul's third journey illustrates this with his base in Ephesus. This city became a strategic hub where teams were equipped and trained daily. These teams would then fan out, likely using the ethne and oikos models we just discussed, to plant multiple churches across the entire province of Asia Minor. The sources see this as Paul operating at his peak effectiveness in terms of disciple making and church planting. And the truly powerful vision here, the sources suggest, is that each new church planted had the potential to become another hub, a center for equipping and sending out more teams. It's inherently reproductive.
Wow. Right.
So the fundamental point being made here is that movements maintain a sharp, singular focus defined by Jesus' commission making disciples and planting churches from those disciples. Denominations or other agencies, while doing many valuable things, often broaden their focus, institutionalizing around various good activities, but in doing so can lose that essential driving purpose that characterizes a movement.
That makes sense. That intense focus gets diluted.
Right. So given this historical blueprint, the big question becomes, how do we actually go about restructuring for movement today? The sources don't suggest abandoning structure altogether. In fact, they argue that functional structures are absolutely essential, not just for transitioning into a movement state for maintenance.
But also to keep it going.
Exactly, but also for keeping a movement from collapsing into disarray or chaos later on. Structure is needed, but the right kind of structure. They touch briefly on the typical life cycle of social movements. You have emergence, where it starts. Coalescence, where it gains momentum, then bureaucratization, where it formalizes, and often, eventually, decline. And the causes of decline they list are telling. Sometimes it's success itself leading to complacency, sometimes organizational failure, sometimes co-optation.
Co-optation, what's that?
That's where leaders start prioritizing maybe organizational targets or maintaining the institution over the core mission and values, or repression from outside, or simply becoming part of the accepted establishment, losing its edge.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Because the material doesn't just describe the problem. It suggests there are specific types of structures needed to reverse that decline, to bring about change for movements. What do those look like?
Exactly. The sources identify 5 key requirements for structures that they argue are vital for reversing decline and fostering movement dynamics. First, these structures must actively cultivate commitment. They need to help everyone involved, pastors, leaders, members, whatever you call them to be, white hot in faith, fully committed to the core mission. This involves proactively building genuine, contagious relationships with people who are maybe far from the mission, being ready for rapid mobilization when opportunities arise, and staying open and adaptable in their methods. The contrast is drawn between employees, which you often find in traditional organizations, and participants, which is what everyone ideally is in a movement.
Everyone's a player, not just staff.
Right. And it's acknowledged that cultivating this level of commitment across the board, even among those who might currently be passive, is a significant challenge. Second, they must identify key movement leaders based on different criteria than traditional organizations. Denominational systems typically rely on clear organizational charts where leadership is defined by holding a specific position or title.
Like senior pastor, director, things like that.
Exactly. Movements, according to the sources, need flexible processes to identify and invest in those who are actively cultivating disciple-making and church-planting reproduction. The key insight here is that leadership isn't defined by a position. It's defined by making things happen by actively reproducing disciples in churches. It's function over title. The material actually outlines 5 levels of leadership they see in this movement context, defined by their function in reproduction. First, seed sowers. That's basically every believer scattering the gospel seed by sharing their story, the gospel, or facilitating simple Bible discussions.
Okay, foundational level.
Foundational. Then, church planters, those who gather new believers, equip the seed sowers, and help new groups become simple churches. Then, church multipliers, they equip and multiply both seed sowers and planters, providing support, correction, and releasing networks of church plants. Fourth, multiplication trainers, they're focused on equipping the multipliers to see reproduction reach the 3rd and 4th generations, going deeper. And finally, movement catalysts who take broader responsibility for initiating and supporting movement among an entire unreached population segment or region, big picture leaders.
Wow, that's quite a different way of looking at leadership roles.
It is, and the sources emphasize that shifting from a leadership model based on position to one based on active participation in reproduction is often a major hurdle for organizations trying to transition.
I can see why. That shift in definition sounds incredibly challenging in established systems. How do you even navigate that?
It is a challenge, absolutely, because it requires letting go of familiar status markers and hierarchies. But the structures themselves need to facilitate it. And that leads to the 3rd requirement. Movement leaders must be actively equipped. The sources argue that movements actually require more structure than stagnant groups, but it's a different kind. It's organic, fluid, designed to grow and change. It's not a rigid, top-down hierarchy like a traditional flowchart, but something more complex and networked. They draw an analogy to peer-to-peer sharing economies.
Like Uber or Airbnb.
Exactly, or even one called Kanya, mentioned in the source. Places where every participant is equipped to play their part directly. This requires more hands-on training, coaching, and equipping embedded in the doing, not just classroom learning. Every person is seen as a potential participant leader in some capacity. And meeting places are flexible homes, cafes, parks, as well as traditional buildings reflecting where the people are and what the mission requires.
And what's more adaptable?
Definitely. Fourth, These structures thrive on stories. Not just any stories, but specifically stories of the Spirit's activity, particularly focusing on instances of disciple-making and church planting reproduction. This is contrasted with information flow in some traditional settings, which might be limited by formal channels or, busy schedules. The material notes that in movement settings, there's often a constant flow of updates, like regular text messages from missional leaders sharing what they're seeing on the ground, and weekly stories and proven resources being shared broadly among those involved. It keeps the focus sharp.
So communication is key, but focused on the mission's progress.
Yes. And fifth, and this is critical, movement structures must align everything with the core mission. The mission of making disciples and planting churches isn't just one item on a list. It's the absolute driving force. It sets the direction. This means theological education gets shaped by it. Ministerial formation curricula are designed specifically to equip leaders at those different reproduction levels we discussed.
And the budget. That sounds like a big one.
Huge. Budgets must fundamentally align to fund movement priorities, no longer primarily supporting maintenance activities that don't directly contribute to reproduction. That's often a painful shift. Movement catalysts play a vital role here in keeping this alignment sharp across the board. And the processes for disciple making and planting are kept intentionally simple, organic, and reproducible so that anyone can participate. The sources mention examples like, yes, a highly educated college seminary professor can do this, but so could the Samaritan woman from John 4 or the Philippian jailer from Acts 16 right after their own encounters. It's meant to be accessible.
Simple, reproducible, accessible. Got it. So putting this all together, what does all of this mean for you, the listener, for the specific context and the sources you brought for this deep dive?
Right. The material includes some really thought-provoking application questions designed specifically for the listener, for you. We want to offer these as points for personal reflection, building on everything we've just explored. So consider these questions the sources put forward. In what ways is your local church or the group you're part of currently taking full responsibility for mission right in your local area or city? What gaps might there be? What opportunities are waiting, maybe? Or what steps might still need to be planned to truly own that local mission field? And thinking about those New Testament multiplication models we discussed, ethnu, relational streams, oikos, household networks, or the hub strategy, which of those, or perhaps some combination, might be most effective or relevant in your specific context? And looking at the idea of restructuring, how could structures in your context be designed or maybe adjusted to actively cultivate that kind of white-hot commitment we talked about? How could you identify and empower leaders based on their participation in making things happen, ensure those leaders are practically equipped, make sure stories of the Spirit's work in reproduction are celebrated and shared, and most fundamentally, how could everything personnel, activities, resources, budgets be truly aligned with that core mission of making disciples and planting churches?
Those are big questions.
They are. And finally, considering the different levels of movement leadership described, from seed sowers all the way up to catalysts, what skills, experiences, or passions do existing people around you, maybe even yourself, already possess that align with these functions? And maybe, honestly, what challenges might you face in realigning roles or even traditional positions towards these core action-oriented movement functions? Lots to think about there.
Wow. Yeah. From Bill, the farmer's difficult choice, to these detailed New Testament blueprints and the very real challenges of restructuring today, that was definitely a lot to chew on.
It really was. It highlights the fundamental shift the sources are arguing for, doesn't it? Moving from primarily maintaining an institution to actively participating in a dynamic movement. It's that shift from leadership defined by position to leadership defined by actively reproducing disciples in churches, with everything tightly focused on that singular core mission. And it requires a willingness to let go of comfortable certainties, just like Bill had to hand over his farm, even when it hurt.
It certainly makes you think about how these deep-seated principles about structure, focus, and participation might apply far beyond just church organizations, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And this raises an important final question. Building on the insights from the sources we looked at today, if the key to reversing decline and fostering a dynamic movement really is this intense focus on the core purpose, if it's about empowering participants defined by their actions and building flexible reproductive structures, how might these same foundational principles be applied to any organization, group, or even a company looking to reignite its purpose, adapt to a changing world, and maximize its impact? Something for you to consider.